is such a perfect place to be bringing this up because these kind of, facts that we are confronted with are huge and feel really insurmountable. That's one of the things I love about this class so much is that we're dealing with things on the interpersonal level and the relational level, which is a form of healing in and of itself. And I really believe that that kind of healing and that relationship building is part of what we need to move forward in the face of all of this. I really want to thank everyone for showing up here and being real and committed to doing this work. Seriously, playlist with audio.
So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, legendary Amiri Baraka.
This is an excerpt from a poem called Why Is We Americans? But reality is an excerpt on television. Why is we Americans? Why is we Americans? Boudita, 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 boudita. Big dee 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 boo dee boo dee boo boo boo. What I want is me, for real. I want me and myself, and what that is what I be and what I see and feel, and who is me and the what it is and who it is and when it me is what it be. I'm gonna be here if I want, like I said, self-determination. But I ain't come from a foolish tribe. We wants the mule, the land. You can make it 300 years of blue chip stock in the entire operation. We want to be paid in a central bank, the average worker farmer wage for all those years we gave it free. Plus we want damages for all the killings and the fraud, the lynchings, the missing justice, the lies and frame-ups, unwarranted jailings, the tar and featherings, the character and race assassinations, historical slander, ugly caricatures. For every Sambo, step and fetch it flick, we want to be paid. For every hurtful thing you did or said, for all the land you took, for all the rapes, all the Rosewoods and Black Wall Street you destroyed, all the miseducation, jobs lost, segregated shacks we lived in, the disease that ate and killed us, for all the mad police that drilled us, for all the music and dances you stole, the styles, the language, the hip clothes you copped, the careers you stopped. All these are suits, specific litigation as represent we, be like we, for reparations for damages paid to the Afro-American nation. Boudita, boudita, boudita. We want education for all of us and anyone else in the black belt hurt by slavery, for all the native peoples, even them poor white people you show all the time is funny, all them Abners and Daisy Mays, them Beverly Hillbillies who never got to know Beverly Hills, who never got to Harvard on their grandfather's wills. We want reparations for them, right on, for the Mexicans whose land you stole, for all of North Mexico, you call it Texas, Arizona, California, New Mexico, Colorado, all that, all that, all that, all that. Be-dee-da, doo-doo. Ba, 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 doo, doo, doo. All that you got to give up. Autonomy and reparations to the Chicanos and the Native Americans whose soul you ripped out with their land. Give self-determination, regional autonomy. That's what Maui is asking, and they're going to do the same when they demand it like us again in their own exploited name. Yeah, the education, that's right. 200 years. We want a central stash, a central bank with democratically elected trustees and a board elected by us all to map out from the referendum we set up what we want to spend it on to build that Malcolm sense self-determination as self-reliance and self-respect and self-defense, the will of what the good Dr. Du Bois beat on. True self-consciousness, simply the psychology of freedom. Boudita, boudita, bidita, boudita, that ba ba ba, boudi boudi boo boo boo. Then we can talk about being American. Then we can listen. Then we can listen without the undercurrent of desire to first set your ass on fire. We will only talk of voluntary unity, of autonomy as vective arms of self-determination if there is democracy in you. That is where it will be shown. This is the only way we as Americans, This is the only truth that can be told. Otherwise, there is no future between us but war, and we as rather lovers and singers and dancers and poets and drummers and actors and runners and elegant heartbeats of the sun's flame. But we is also at the end of our silence and sit down. We is at the end of being under your ignorant smell, your intentional hell. Either give us our lives or plan to forfeit your own.
Really honored to be able to welcome today both Dominique and Liam. We 2 weeks ago, before we had our spring break, we went to a cruise and Melbourne Giant. So looking back, how we got to be here, and some of the folks in the class. So being hosted by a class called Environments, Justice, and Wellbeing. It's in Anthropology and Environmental Studies. So could a few of you give a kind of brief summary of the things we talked about? Where did we get to?
The idea of reparations, specifically in the Twin Cities and then in St. Paul, as well as the history of Minnesota and how, despite being a northern state, a lot of the spaces and institutions that we have were still unfortunately founded by slave owners.
Part of our statement and commentary here too is hearing about the St. Paul program. How we got to a point where St. Paul, particularly where we're located, is thinking about like how do we prepare to think about around the neighborhood. So our goal today was to be able to jump forward and to say, how do we, from our various perspectives, connected or disconnected with those conversations as we may have done, get into being able to go forward. So we talked a little bit also in the webinar with the giving us a base vocabulary that was talking about reparations, both in terms of those of the unskilled which is an existing one, what's happening around generational housing, and also in about land, putting the infrastructure, justice, and housing building in Evanston into conversation with a couple of Anishinaabe tribes. With the infrastructure, and so we've been thinking we're on Anishinaabe and Dakota lands. We're in a place that has been involved in social and ecological relationships. So how can we learn how to be the new? So I'm really grateful to Melvin, as you can imagine, this spokesperson who I fully introduced to both of you. And I think what probably makes more sense is rather than me continuing to bring this to the floor over to you to introduce yourselves as you wish, and to carry on with this hour however you want. So like to have our panelists given, you're welcome to. If you want to move around, you're also welcome to do that. But can you all help me in welcoming them? Thank you so much for coming. I show them where they can be seen.
Hey everybody, my intro is going to be real short. My name is Dominique, the organizer. I live on the other side of the railroad tracks. I've been organizing the Twin Cities as long as I've been here. Most of the stuff I've done has been about the impact of state violence on Black and brown communities. I worked against U.S. militarization. My job is relevant to the conversation earlier, but I work for Sierra Club with conservation, pushing now to become a climate justice organization. So some of my work intersects in all different.
Good afternoon. Appreciate you taking time out to come on the Race and Health Equity Administrator for the Public Wellness Service team over in Ramsey County. So it's the largest service team in Ramsey County, comprises of over 2,000 of Ramsey County's 4,000 employees. I'm also the first male doula and lactation educator in the history of the state of Minnesota, one of the first 3 in all of North America. as of 5 years ago, 4 to 5 years ago. I'm a transplant. I played football, ran track in Florida. Moved back to South Florida, came back here. And ever since I've really graduated from college, actually I went to college because I thought I was going to be a museum curator. Life in the universe has a way of kind of like changing the narrative of what you want to do and putting you in what it would like for you to do. And so I've been working in the community, whether it be with schools, nonprofits, running youth outreach programs or adult outreach programs ever since I graduated back in 2005. So yeah, that's a short little intro to who I am. And kind of happy to be here with you all today.
Sort of kind of what we've been doing, what this class is meant to do in the bigger picture. Not to put people on the spot with, but what not to say about. Got to explain in an elevator to someone what this class is all about.
I would say that environmental issues and social issues overlap a lot in this. Us just taking a look at that overlap and trying to do it in a way that is forming community and making it feel that we can take a handle of the situation and not completely go into any like fear of trying to take a handle of the situation. Those three things, and yeah, that kind of. Yeah. Community.
One of the things that Melvin has charged us to do is to host the May reconciliation lunch. So part of what we're doing, we just come back for the second half of the term, is to be thinking about what are some of the topics that need reconciliation in our community, or where we actually have the scope to be able to hold a space to discuss that.
Did you bring us bubbles?
You did bring us bubbles.
I can do it.
Reconciliation was just a good group. Y'all enjoy that. What's something you liked about the class? Like, what's one thing that just stuck with you?
The projects we did like a couple weeks ago. My group made like a futuristic robot team for it. Kind of like, use the advancement. It's here, we can do it right now.
In this class?
Could somebody back up a couple more steps and explain what the context is?
It's a cool class.
That's good.
I'm glad to see you all like really rested your brains.
Well, I think we all came up with really different things for that project, so it's like everyone has their own explanation for what.
It's always true.
Was a big picture explanation for like how we did the projects and what those were supposed to be about.
I can explain that if no one else wants to. So it was with Janaki from Pura. And so it was basically like rituals around food and pantries, how we interact with food, what it represents to us, like the various mechanisms that go into bringing food from a farm to a table or to that pantry, to the future kitchen. They were showing like the ways that something as ancient as tea, for example, will probably still be around in a future world, but how it will be different. Like it'll be a tea making robot rather than standing there and having to do it for yourself. We had another group that talked about slaughterhouse, the way that a cow goes in and all the different like uses of the undesirable parts of the animal in sectors not related to food. It's some people who were talking about like where foods come from and the environmental impact that they have on it. And so it just goes into that idea of like ritual, community, and understanding like the intersections of various aspects of food, community, environment, justice, so on.
Apartheid group. Bunch of foods tied from the ceiling. You can imagine which ones are reachable.
Reminds me of a conversation I had a little while ago with another person, and activists are kind of obnoxious, if you hadn't noticed already. Somebody was just saying, man, y'all are so negative. Like, y'all always talking about you got to tear down this, you got to abolish that. And like, what about the stuff you want to build? And I think that's a real valid point. But I also think like we probably need like 75, 25, because I think there's a lot more we probably need to tear down. And the things that we need to build, right, and to like live from abundance is already in us. It's just kind of blocked by a lot of systems. So I told him that, his comment made me feel like he was being negative. He should leave and let us activists be better together.
That always true.
It's a long shirt.
The number of
Activists be
people,
better together.
yes, the number of people who've heard me quote you on the 75-25 is probably high in this room. There's this idea that like we need to live in the social world we want to have in the future, but there are some pieces that need to be torn down in that. So I wonder if both of you could talk a little bit about in the work you do, where you see that now. Like, what are you building? What do you need to tear down?
Probably not gonna make you very happy with the fact that I think being somebody that works in government, but then also works on my own, there's a lot we need to tear down, almost everything that we need to tear down. Because when we're talking about, especially me speaking from the perspective of an African American out in this country, almost every system that was put together to either exploit me or at my expense, right? At the expense of people who look like me. And so when you have a system that is constructed and built that way, I think that the question has to be asked, like, can you really reform all that? You can't reform 100% of the things that were built to carry out a specific agenda. That's just not how it works, right? And so when I say that, again, it's not even to be negative, it's just being realistic. Because we also got to talk about the fact too, like I used to hear this said a lot, like, especially when you do this type of work, like you do hear people talk about like negative rhetoric or the negative speak or whatnot, but like, is it negative or is it being realistic, right? And there's nothing wrong with being realistic. And when I'm talking about being realistic, I'm talking about when we talked about like reconciliation earlier, right? We talk about reconciliation earlier. What is the first thing you got to do in reconciliation? Somebody, anybody. That comes before that.
Professor sins.
What's that?
Admit like your sins.
Exactly. Admit that something's wrong to begin with. If you and I lived in the same community, like we're neighbors or whatnot, and you come up and I don't have any kids, but you do something that, to harm one of my children or that damages one of my property, and you were intentional about it at that. You coming over and trying to build a relationship with me without even acknowledging your intention before that. And let's not even forget the fact that like some of those intentional things still happen. I'm not trying to build a relationship with you. I don't want to hear what you got to say. You can't do harm to me or my family or people I care about, and then come to me and have a conversation as if everything is normal without first owning up to what you did. Then let's have a conversation to talk about how we're going to fix that. Then we can talk about the those are the first seeds to build a relationship. Repair the damage that was done. Right? And so I think that's in a lot of ways that a lot of times that's the biggest issue. This country as a whole, there's this attitude of wanting to get in and do all the feel good stuff without getting in the muck and the dirt first, without having the negative feelings and dealing with that first. I do consulting with direct care service providers and public health nurses and stuff all the time. And I talk about institutional structural racism as it pertains to the healthcare system and Black and brown women in the birth space. And one of the things that, I focus a lot on that, like, what are we doing? Like, how much are you being forthright with the work that you've been doing, the systems that you're a part of, and the history of the organization you work for. Even in Ramsey County, like there's all this push around doing like work, doing community engagement, going out, working with the community. And then there were some of my peers who are kind of absent to the fact that they don't understand why there's so much animosity with the community when they come there. And I go like, you represent an organization that like you're going out to address disparities, that's great. But you represent an organization that is responsible for 85 of the disparities that you're going out to fix. 85% of the disparities that you say you're going out to fix. You may not have been like the person who instituted those policies and procedures, but you work for the organization that does. You might not be somebody who is intentionally or actively being racist, but you're being racist and continuing to abide by the policies and the racist policy and procedures of the organization that you work with, right? And that's even something that I had to like, when I started working for, you know what I'm saying, for the local government, like I had to come to grips with and figure out ways of what are ways in which I can do the good work and not continue to perpetuate racism upon the same community that I live and reside in, right? And one of the things like going back to kind of, you guys bear with me because I kind of go off in tangents and stuff a lot. One of the things that I feel like we do as a society here, like again, we like to hover on all the positive stuff without talking about the negative and dealing with the negative, you know, the negative impacts of stuff. And that's just not realistic. Like it isn't. Anybody in here who's into sports or an athlete or whatever, like lifting weights all the time ain't fun. Getting stronger and getting faster ain't, you know what I'm saying? Like there's a process to that. You know what I mean? Like there's hurt, there's pain, there's grit, there's mornings where you don't want to get up. I get up every morning and I work out before work. I lift weights before work. In the evenings, I do cardio and I do yoga. I can promise you, every morning when I get up in the morning, I'm not jumping out of the bed going, let's go, let's hit these weights. Let's go jump in the gym. You know what I mean? There are days where I'm up to it and I want to do it, and there are days where I'm just like, man, the alarm went off, but the way my sleep rhythm is set up, this ain't about to happen. But if I want to get to the good part at the end of feeling better, you know what I'm saying? Like feeling better, being more healthy and stuff like that, I got to address the ugly part at the beginning. The fact that I'm tired, the fact that maybe I'm just lazy that morning. The fact that maybe I haven't eaten well and taken care of my nutrition. The fact that maybe I'm just going through some personal stuff. You know what I mean? Maybe things aren't going great with my family. Maybe my work is dragging me down. Maybe I'm just not a happy person at the moment. Like we got to get out of the habit of always wanting to be like, have everything be fun. Everything's always got to be fun and got to be like great during the process. And that's just not realistic. I also coach high school soccer, and I kind of went off on my boys one day. They were like dogging it out in practice, and they're like, so we, you know, the coaches we stopped was like, what's the deal? Like, what's going on? Like, y'all wasting my time right now. Well, coach is just like, we're not having fun anymore. I was like, you're not having fun. Cool, I ain't having fun either. I've been at work all day. I've been in meetings dealing with politicians, talking about stuff that I don't want to talk about like all the time. I could be going home. Instead, I'm here from 7 to 9:30 in the evening working with you. Everything is not fun. And I feel like this day and age, like everybody has this like mental, like this thought process that there's an entitlement to everything being fun and being comfortable. And to be quite honest, I kind of don't blame you, because that's one of the tenets of white supremacy, the right to comfort. And even for Black and brown people, if you're raised in a white supremacist society, you're going to pick up some of those traits. Everything is going to be comfortable.
I spent part of this weekend, I was just telling them, with people who wrote course texts, and there was an activist in the Amazon, older, and it made me think about a generational difference too. So she was like, I'm working with these Indigenous people, but the rules have changed and we can't fix the problem. And I had this moment that was so interesting, because it was like somehow this person who's probably in her 70s, it's like every place I've ever gone, I've been able to fix the problem. And now I can't fix the problem. Like, this is what most people living alive feel now, is they can't fix the problems. But it's interesting that some people have the privilege to always have their effort be like not necessarily fun, but rewarded. Yeah, like what is it to do the work? So we talked a lot with Melvin about futility and joy. Like, and one of the things that's that part of break reading, he mentioned the audit of racism in institutional culture in
Right.
Ramsey County. And so I was able to find the audit, read the history, like how we got here, and then I couldn't find the so what and what. But I feel like that's often, it's like, so we do the work, we get into the past, and that's, I think this is part of what led us to inviting you two particularly, because I feel like you spend a lot of time in the thick of like, so we got to a place where we maybe started to notice something was wrong. Now, how do we do that work? Of sitting with what's wrong and figuring out how to do it different.
This quote from Malcolm X where he says, you don't stab a knife 9 inches in someone's back, pull it out 3 inches and call that progress.
Absolutely.
And that's a lot of what that makes me think of. And being in the thick of it, I guess is a good way, that's how I like to put it too. So much of what you were speaking about has to do with like the psychological aspect of power, right? Because it is hard to risk that discomfort. It is hard, especially when you're in a position where your ignorance can make you feel better, can be providing all of that. And so the vulnerability that's required to fight the cognitive dissonance, right, of breaking up white supremacy, how it's internalized by folks who are white, folks who are not white, folks who are protecting whiteness. It's a huge task. And I feel like in terms of the building, that's a little bit where I'm at as an organizer right now, is continuing to build resilience in this skill of developing vulnerability, of understanding your interpersonal relationships and how that affects the greater picture of things. Because I think in bringing it back to reparations a little bit, to be able to allow folks to step outside of that need for that psychological safety, start to understand the impacts of history, their role in perpetuating whatever that history is, that will require a lot of trust, right? And that trust is going to be necessary because when we talk about reparations, we're going to need a huge shift in systems. And I think this comes back to other things that we want to build, because reparations for me is not successful if all it does is redistribute poverty equally among all the races, right? It has to be a subversion, right? So the reason that Black folks are to be lifted up through this, Black folks who are descended from enslaved Africans, is because we're the basis of that, right? We're the foundation of a lot of where that oppression came from and how it exists today. So I think so much of what we have to do in terms of building is just protecting our willingness and our skill to work with one another and just acknowledge history.
I like what you said of that. Wouldn't you also say though too, that there has to be like basic fundamental knowledge of like, I would call social justice terms. Like for instance, you would be amazed at how many people that I've run into on a professional level who still don't even know the difference between equity and equality. Two completely different things, completely different concepts. Equality means I'm giving the same thing to everybody. Equity means I'm giving each person what they need to be successful, no matter where that is. But it also means, which seems to fly over the head of a lot of people, just because I give, just for example, you more than you, doesn't mean that I'm actually taking anything from you. I'm just giving this person more than what I've given you because that maybe they started off behind where you were. So they need more. And so I found that a lot, especially times when I've been in like predominantly white spaces and we talk about equity, and there's pushback from that. And I've heard all sorts of things, from, well, it wasn't us. I know some of you probably heard that. It wasn't us, it was our ancestors, or that was 3-4 generations ago when these things were happening, and folks are benefiting from slavery and Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. And my pushback to that is, you're right, you weren't there, but you're still benefiting from the profits. It's easy to say pick yourself up by the bootstraps when you got a 403-year head start. It's easy to do so. And it's funny too, because those same people who seem to be history majors at that point in time, when they're refuting these things, didn't do enough of their history to realize that the same people who spoke about the whole concept of picking yourself up by the bootstraps didn't pick themselves up by the bootstraps either. So I think it's like a combination thing before you can even really do the work effectively. You got to be willing to like you said, have those conversations, talk about trust, build trust with one another. You gotta be honest with one another. You gotta be willing to be uncomfortable. And then the education part comes in too. Because you also gotta, like, everybody's gotta be speaking from the same, I would say it's more beneficial for people to speak from that same foundational use of terms or language than different parts, because our conversation is not gonna get anywhere if we're having the debate using the same word, but we have different meanings for it. I've watched that just like crumble gloriously, especially in the space when I've seen Black people and white people in the same space and the term racism comes up. And I hear white people use the term reverse racism. And then the way that they, like, that I see like the atmosphere change when I hear Black people say, I can't be racist. There's no such thing as Black people being racist. And and at that very moment, it's as if the non-Black people in this space feel like they're just being gaslighted. And how can we continue this conversation? And then you have to, again, this is where the difference in understanding the language comes into place. Because then you have to, because I've had to mediate that before and have to go in and give them the definition. Well, for a Black person to be racist, they have to have control over systems and structures. They have to be able to affect your livelihood, you being able to get a job, you being able to feed your family, affect your social determinants of health. So by the definition of racist, no, Black people can't be racist. They can be hateful, they can be bigoted, and that's different. Doesn't make it any better, but they can be hateful and they can be bigots, but they can't be racist. Now, as a white person, if you move yourself to a different part of the world where you're the minority, you move yourself to a country in Africa or in Asia where people who look like you don't control the systems, then you can be a victim of racism. But that can't happen here. And so I think those three things, that common language, that honesty, the building of relationships, like you were talking about, like you mentioned before, it's just not the first thing, but the building of relationships, the being vulnerable, all those things goes into this work. And that's just the very beginning of it. This is a whole lot of work that demands a lot of emotional labor, intellectual labor. There are gonna be nights we're gonna go home and wanna punch holes in the walls. Some of you are gonna wanna cry. Some of you are gonna wanna see a therapist. It's just how it goes.
Just in a name that I have a lot of questions. That's part of why I'm university professor. But like, if you have questions or comments, please feel free. Pause for space for that.
Answered this a little bit already, but when it comes to like mediation in a scenario like that, what do you think is kind of the best thing to do? Is it like acknowledging language and trying to provide definitions or like a baseline, I guess, for everyone? Just like the scenario you brought up is really interesting and really challenging of like, what do you do when two groups of people understand a word on opposite sides of the spectrum?
I don't have an answer, but okay. So I mean, I feel like I traffic in conflict a lot as well. So I'm a restorative justice practitioner, and oftentimes, so much of that time is spent in developing a relationship so that we can create that shared sense of understanding. Because without that shared sense of understanding, we're really talking about two different things. So I don't directly have a response for how I can deal with that in these instances, but I will say that the lack of clarity is something that is actively sought out and abused by folks who want to continue the power. I think this idea that we can disagree about what racism is right now while we have someone dog whistling however many thousands of Proud Boys to come out of hiding and protect their entitlement to the White House, right? I think the entire MAGA movement has been an instance in manipulating the language of who's really oppressed in terms of reasserting their dominance.
I would say you answered that great. But also, yeah, there's other part. You'd be amazed at how many times I've been in conversations where there's, you can see conflict like arising and becoming more and more fierce. And nobody stops to, like, it's assumed that everybody's talking about the same thing. It's assumed that everybody has the same meaning for the same thing. And you have to be like, wait a second, let's take a break here and practice some active listening. And this is active, I urge everybody to really like, practice active listening and use it, at all points in time, because this is where you can catch those things really. So when you hear somebody say something, so what I'm hearing you saying is X, Y, and Z. They're either going to confirm or deny what you repeated to them. And if they're going to deny what you repeated to them, you can ask them for clarification. And the same goes for the other parties. And more times than not, there are times a lot of times that they're talking about the same thing and it's just different ideologies. But more times than not, that I've been doing this work, especially when we talk about issues that revolve around race, I'm not even talking about the same thing. I mean, the idea of reparations from what I hear in the Black community versus what I hear in non-Black communities is completely different. It's different within the Black community. Because like I want to be out there too, like the Black community is not a monolith either. You know what I mean? But so it's vitally important to do that, to ask for clarification, practice that active listening. If there's something that doesn't seem quite clear to you, making sure that you ask those questions, not be afraid to ask those questions. If there's something that might be clear to you, but seems like there can be these discrepancies between individuals, asking them to clarify that. I think all too often when there are conversations happening about race, especially amongst people who aren't of the same race, there's always a couple people there who are afraid of offending somebody or being labeled a racist or stepping on that landmine. So folks don't want to dig a little bit deeper, be vulnerable, ask the questions they're embarrassed to ask, or what's that? Yeah, all of those, I like all those things. And I think it's vitally important to like be a little bit vulnerable, step out and ask those questions. Sorry, go ahead.
No, finish your thought.
No, I was just gonna say, like, and it's also important to like amongst these conversations, like use discernment. Like use discernment. Like you're all college students, you're all, folks who are adept at critical thinking. Gotta trust your gut. You know the difference between when somebody's asking you a question or saying something out of malice versus being ill-informed or being curious.
So my question is kind of a continuation of hers. I know for me personally, I'm an environmental studies and public health major, and I'm a senior, so I've spent a lot of time in my classes kind of talking about and especially in classes with like Valentine or Susie Keefe, thinking about the history of oppression, the way that racism exists at like structural levels in both local and global communities. And I know as I get ready to enter the workforce, I'm often thinking of how to balance being in a space, especially with people of multiple races as a person, and being able to talk about things such as how structural racism affects communities. Conversations like this, I struggle with not wanting to put explaining some of these issues solely on the aggrieved parties, because I think a lot of the time we just expect that all a Black person wants to talk about is, the ways that they were discriminated against or oppressed. And I don't want to say that that's not true, but it shouldn't only be on that population, on the aggrieved population, to talk about how they were aggrieved. But I also don't want to come in and be like, well, I know better because I went to college and talked about this. And so it's like balancing how to be an advocate or an ally and be able to talk about these things and not put it solely on the people who have been oppressed, but to also not feed into that like infantilizing kind of white supremacist kind of thinking, if that made any sense.
Yeah, and I can imagine the position too, but I think there's a lot of ways to look at impact, And I think like from your perspective as a white person, there's certainly a lot of facts that you can deliver, right? There's an objective factual history, although it's not necessarily rooted in your lived experience. And maybe then that points to your role of creating an environment where folks feel that sense of safety to share their subjective experiences with people who are impacted by it. But maybe there's a lot to be said for you really standing and owning. There are certain things I know about how white supremacy is perpetuated. I'm prepared to deliver that. I don't necessarily know how it feels to be on the receiving end of it, but I can certainly help us to develop that shared language and to develop an analysis around it. And hopefully those who feel really moved to speak about those impacts will at least feel that their environment is open to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So here's the thing about being an ally. No one can call themselves an ally. You're made an ally by those who need you to be in that space. And being an ally will look different depending on who you're in the space with. So you being an ally to one person may look like you stepping in and delivering that information, delivering those facts, and speaking up because maybe they don't feel comfortable speaking up. They don't feel safe enough in the space as a minority or an oppressed individual to speak up in that space. Another person might be like, nah, hold my drink, I got this shit. You know what I mean? Like, just stand right there. I got this. I'm about to read them real quick. And that is your role as an ally in that moment, right? So again, that discernment, what is your relationship with the individuals like there? And having those conversations, kind of like Dominique said, like having that shared language and what are you doing? More importantly though, too, what are you doing outside those moments to kind of dismantle these systems and these situations and to, prevent these situations?
And in those moments, would you say it's appropriate, you don't know the person's super well to ask? Or is it better to, because I try and act and listen first, and I don't just want to stand there and, be known and be like, yeah,
Right.
yeah, but in my positionality.
Absolutely. It's like you said, like listen and ask, you know what I mean? Like, there's absolutely like, nothing wrong with that. Also, there's again, going back to what I said earlier too, like everybody thinks that being an ally and kind of fighting against oppression or whatever is what do you do in the moment of action when everything is going down, right? I'll tell you, I'm the son of two military families. My mother and my father are both in the military. My dad was in the Terrier. Most of the battles, most of the wars are won not on the battlefield. It's in the planning stage. This is what are you doing when all the fighting is not going on, right? So what are you doing outside of that situation to make sure that situation doesn't even happen in the future? What type of conversations are you having with people that look like you and in your place of work so that you don't even have to worry about that down the line? It's one of the biggest things that framework and that line, I think, is one of the biggest reasons why. And hear me out. Like I hated seeing Black Lives Matter signs out throughout my neighborhood because I live near the Grand Avenue Summit. Not because I don't believe in Black Lives Matter, not because I don't think Black Lives Matter. The reason I didn't appreciate it is because before people started tearing everything up in Minneapolis, you didn't see not one of those signs. To me, it was the equivalent of like Passover, the blood of the lamb being on somebody's door. Please don't come damage my property. Anybody can do that. What do you do in your family? What do you do in your personal life? What do you do in your workspace to show anybody that Black Lives Matter to you? Right? Putting the sign or waving the flag at that moment in time, to me, that was the equivalent of not doing the behind the scenes work. And I'm going to do some self-preservation and I'm going to support you secondary.
So can I ask a follow-up question on this? And this kind of goes back to the question Zoe was asking. I mean, and I think it's a question in general of the relationship between learning spaces and activist spaces. Because I feel like exception in which all of a sudden we've noticed this thing matters.
Yep.
It's like a moment which we're going to be woke to some topics. And I feel like this is one of the problems with having institutions of learning. It's like we learn when we're inside these institutions. or like we're activists when we're in our activist job. And I think, you know, as all of you who work with me, I've gotten a sense, I think we need to do all the things all the time. I mean, in a balanced way. But I'm really curious, especially when you're working in spaces like with the Department of Transportation. Dominique, I know you've been doing a lot of work, and like mobility justice is a topic I know people are interested in around the highway, or working with public health. Like these are spaces in which people perceive themselves to be doers and not necessarily learners. And I was
You'd be surprised.
oh, well, this is the question I want to hear more about. It's like, where is the space? I've heard you say is about how people learn so they can do, but so they can learn. And like that doing and learning needs to be rolling. And I'm curious what you notice and what you build. Like, what are successful things that people can practice to stay in a learning mindset? Like, not to not be doing, but like to have that active we do. And I would like to be surprised now.
That's something else.
I do, but
Go ahead. Go ahead.
so as a Black man and as a young Black kid who for part of my life went to private school where everybody else was white, I was constantly in a state of having to learn. I was having to learn how to make other people feel safe. I was having to learn were their comments condescending or were they genuine? I was having to learn how do I move in this space without somebody being intimidated or being worried that I'm doing something wrong. I was having to learn how do I show up in a space and prove that I belong here and not a token, right? I was having to learn, and at the same time, what the Dusty is like, I was having to learn like, or about myself and my Blackness in that space. What I'm getting at is like, as a Black person, and a lot of, and I'll speak for myself, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but like, you're constantly in a state of learning. Once again, when you live in a society that is built and constructed around white supremacy, like you're constantly in a state of learning. So if you want to be an ally, you should constantly be in a state of learning. Every opportunity is a learning situation, even ones that don't go successful or go your way. I was always taught that even, and this is more of like a sports analogy, like even when you lose, do you really lose? Because a loss is another opportunity to learn how to win, right? So when you are, your question kind of coincides with a question that I heard that I got from a coworker, because one of the things we do is audit policy and procedure, that I do is audit policy and procedure over at the county. They were talking about the different ways in which they execute their work. Ask the question, is it really a policy? Well, I don't know. They said it's a policy. Well, let's research it. A lot of people in our spaces don't even know if our stuff is policy or procedure. Policy is attached to law. It's legal. You got to stick to it. Procedure, that's just shit we do to make stuff easier and more convenient for ourselves, which means it isn't binding, which means you can change it at the drop of a dime. That's a learning opportunity. It didn't take anything else being in some drastic situation to do that. What are you doing in the space? Is it the policy or procedure? If it's a procedure, why do we have this procedure in place? Who does this procedure affect? Who does it not? Well, if it's a policy, how did it get put in play? When was the genesis of it? We have a tool that we use called a race equity RBA tool. And it's basically a tool that we use that was created a couple years ago in Ramsey County. And we use it before anybody starts writing any grant, before they try to put any new policy and procedures in, they got to answer all these questions. And they're equity questions. Who does it benefit? Who does it directly affect? Who does it indirectly affect? What are the impacts, positive or negative? All these sorts of things. Like, to be an ally, what excuses you from having to learn all the time, like I had to learn all the time just to survive? And so I would say the learning you don't look for an opportunity to learn. The learning never stops if you start thinking like more proactively about like just being inquisitive about the situation you're in, right? Being inquisitive about everything that you do. And if it sounds exhausting, it absolutely is. But Rome wasn't built in a day.
So when it's a procedure or when it's a policy, are you then finding that like infrastructure is being built to change it?
Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. If I spot it, it is, because that's part of my job, it's what I do. And you have, and again, if it's a procedure, sometimes it's really easy. If it's a policy, sometimes you got to go through a lot of other stuff to do it. But everything is not going to be easy either, because we also have a lot of people in our workspace who are invested in things being the way they are, right? You got people who are invested who've been at the job 20, 30 years. It makes their job easier. You know, somebody's saying like, I don't want to change. Like I might not be, they might not be affected by it personally, but they're like, I don't want to change the way we do this because it's going to make everybody that works for me mad. And as a manager, the supervisor, I don't want to be getting emails or having people come sit in my office about it. So their concern is more or less about troubleshooting people's behaviors and people's feelings rather than what's more equitable for the community and people we serve. Sometimes you got to deal with that, and that makes stuff harder. Because when we talk about changing people's jobs and how they do things, everybody's not willing to do that. I have a saying like, everybody loves change. Nobody has a problem with change. Only time people have a problem with change is when it affects something that directly affects them. That's when people care about change. Then it's when you start to see like unions get involved and stuff like that, especially if it's like a union position.
So that's why you went first. You said your father was an interrogator? All questions going through it. Yeah, I mean, so much of what I'm hearing and just reflecting on what you're saying is like the inverse to that, which is that compliance is rewarded, like blind compliance, because as we've addressed throughout this whole talk, like the systems that are set up right now serve a certain group of people, and folks in power would like to perpetuate that power to keep it that way. So this act of learning, of being a lifelong learner, of learning through relationships, I believe learning through a lot of that is doing the work. Like a lot of that is learning what needs to be undone, who needs to be zones of discomfort, who needs to be pushed out of power. And the story of how that develops is kind of the change that we create. So I also think, I mean, in addition to being a lifelong learner, there's a lot to be said for disrupting the compliant, right? And understanding systems that reward compliance over systems that reward critical thinking. I've heard it said when I did youth work a long time ago that oftentimes, you know, when you're working with younger students, like children, elementary, that the kid acting out in the room is likely to be the most healthy kid in that room, right? What do we do with the kid who acts out in the room? Well, they don't make it to college, right? So all these systems of removal for folks who do question authority, for folks who do think critically at their own risk or at the risk of systems they depend on, they're punished. They're removed from an ability to make change. You know, it's hard to climb up to a position of authority when you don't have the academic record that says that you've been able to make it there.
That's a great example that picks up what Hannah's saying, where you are often in positions to say, oh, that person that you're disciplining for being out of line had a really good question. We all share that question. This is a system that should be changed. So I would love to give an example that goes deep in the weeds. Feel free to jump track to a different kind of topic. But I think this is something I've been spending a lot of time on, and I'm interested kind of in how this plays as an example, but also whether this kind of systems change, like whether this is an invitation to think about some of the systems change you see being possible. So as I've mentioned to most of you, I spent the last 2 years trying to figure out why small scale agriculturalists don't get support in Ramsey County. Like there's a lot of evidence to suggest that there's this policy in place that says basically you need 10 acres to be eligible for a lot of the supports. And the supports are basically not having to pay as much tax and getting access to other kinds of like land and other kinds of infrastructural support. And this is a great example where it turns out it is a policy that acres, or you have a greenhouse not being defined. So
historically, who's going to have access to that?
Yeah, right, totally. And also what's the easy justification? Like it's partly, you know, we need to feed the world. It's export agriculture. It's grow commodities, grow a lot of something. And there's also a lot of kind of rules in place, like at individual municipal levels that are like, yeah, your home garden doesn't count. So again, like we know there's a lot of backgrounds that's trying to get people to be part of the labor force. Be like, you can't feed yourself because we need We need people to be hungry to do jobs that people don't really want to do. So there's some pernicious background here. There's also some progressive background here. There's some evidence that people with 10 acres and a horse were trying to like use that as a tax loophole, trying to like be wealthy people who weren't paying taxes. That's what everybody's focused on. What we've discovered after a year of like, where are people who put up a tiny greenhouse and are like, yeah, so I'm gardening or I'm farming here. And they're like, yeah, you're not real farmers. Turns out there's a revenue, like tax revenue guidance books that tell people you can interrogate the people about what they're doing. And then it turns out we have, I don't know if you realize this, Twin Cities has the most agrarian knowledge probably of anywhere in like not directly on the coasts, because contingency of who has migrated and the relationships that have brought people here, there are just a ton of people from agricultural expertise who live not able to move out into the rural areas or gain land because of aforementioned racist structures who can't access this. And then it turns out a lot of the crops they're growing aren't legible. So you're a tax assessor, you've got a manual, it tells you what are you growing here? And it's only recently, say we've got like a really active group of Kenyan farmers who are like, well, this thing that you call a weed is actually an escaped vegetable. And like by growing this stuff all together, it's much more efficient and it's not just messy. Some crops better. And in the recent climate conditions we've had, people are suddenly like, huh, maybe this is more. I'm curious, like when you you're like, all right, here's a system that's not working at its best. It's disadvantaging a lot of people. Like, I totally see that when we get people together, they revert back to exactly where we started in this conversation, which is like, wait, you want to take away from the wealthy farmers to give to these other people? Like you want to disrupt the system that's easy for the tax assessors and make them learn about agriculture? And I've gone deep into the weeds because it's such a real example and it's impactful. Like there's so many people who could be sharing like a set of federal resources that you may hear about. It's one of the largest packages of federal programs that contribute to people being able to think outside these boxes. And the boxes are ones that we know, like part of what we've been talking about is how we dismantle the boxes that keep people thinking in these like, no, we can't do that ways. Oh yeah, like we are sorry for what we've contributed to those boxes, and we could do this differently. And you don't have to stick in my kind of example, like in the areas where you work, what shifts that terrain? And
So one of the things that we've been doing at Ramsey County, and one of the things that I personally do is, so one of the things that we do, I'll talk about what we do at Ramsey County first, and then one of the things that I personally do that actually assists me on a personal life, and then also work. But one of the things that we do at Ramsey County that make a lot of things more equitable is we actually just include community in a lot of stuff. There are community members on our interview panels, even for not even just entry-level jobs, but even for director-level jobs. You're a public servant, the community ought to have a say in who's going to fill that job and who's going to fill that role. Do they have the credentials? Do they have a racial equity lens? Do they care about the community, right? Community has a stake in the type of application questions that even get put out when people are applying for jobs, right? Interview questions, all those sorts of things. We try to include community on everything. And not only do we just include community, but we also pay them for their time, right? So if we need you for an hour to take part in said interview or whatever, we're gonna give you $50 an hour, right? We give you $50 for that hour. Because one of the things that, all of you will learn once you get out into your profession or whatever, 6 months into your job, you may think that you're like 100% of a radical thinker, but 6 months into your job, you become institutionalized. What I mean by that is once you get through that onboarding process, your brain innately starts to think around the confines, rules, and regulations of your profession, of your job. What better way to try to maintain perspective and give you access to, or an ability to kind of pull yourself out of that, is to have somebody else in that space that isn't bound to the same rules and stuff that you are. That's one of the strategies and one of the ways you use into thinking outside the box, right? Have somebody who's not even in the box, who's all in that great space out there. Even in my personal life, when there's actually been things that I've been questioned, like I've tried to come up with ideas about how to address something at work. And I'll actually call and ask one of my sisters. She could not really tell you what I do, right? Doesn't know a whole lot about what I do. And she will just rattle out a bunch of ideas. Now, 85% of those ideas is like, come on, sis. This isn't even viable, this isn't work, this don't have, were you listening to me, right? 15% of those ideas, pure brilliance. Wait a minute, I didn't think about that. Wait a second, not only did I not think about that, we don't have a rule in place that says we can't do that. We don't have a policy in place that says we can't do that. Yeah, let me take this back to work in the meeting, throw this on the table in front of everybody and see what we can do with that. Keep people around you that, you know what I mean, like that don't, not only don't think like you, but don't do the same thing that you do. I just recently hired two new people on direct report for myself. And one of the things that I use as a strategy, and they're working out beautifully, is people who don't even have a background in what it is that we do. And we think about it, like, I think that a lot of times that makes the most like creative thinkers. Listen, my degree is in history, political science, and art. However, my career is in public health, and now I moved into an administrative role at the largest service team in Ramsey County. I won a national award as a national 40 under 40 in public health. I don't have a bachelor's in public health or a master's in public health. And I strongly believe that the reason that I've been successful in that is because some of the ideas that I've come up with at work that have worked and been very successful is I haven't been trained in a traditional public health manner. I don't have that same like background that they have in public health. So while they might come up with like good ideas, they're not necessarily outside the box like you would think. Mine's outside the box because like I didn't have a professor telling me that I can't do that. I didn't take a grad school course telling me I can't do that. I use lived experience and work that I've done in the community. Did some active listening, worked with my coworkers, who are some brilliant people in their own right, and put things together and not being afraid to fail. But I think we got to stop thinking that you also have to be like classically trained in whatever it is that you're trying to be great at or solve a problem for, because you don't.
So much of that hits on, the only word I could think of to respond to that was just organizing. I mean, the example you gave of your sister, or even how you approach who you decide to hire that with. I got a similar experience too, because I found that I'm 33 now and I've been really since high school. And I've noticed now that a lot of the newer folks coming in to like work with me at Sierra Club or other nonprofits, a lot of them came from like a social justice arc, so like a liberal arts college. That's great because you should be able to learn what you want to learn. It doesn't always equip you with the skill set to fight the power, right? Oftentimes those soft skills that you need, those instincts that you need, sometimes those are beat out of your brain because of all the coursework that you have to do. And so there's so much to be said in keeping a group with diverse mentality around you. Because the other side of those cooperatives and those collaboratives, when public agencies or private institutions, when they do want to invite community to the table, what happens sometimes, they'll take your feedback, they'll come back with something totally different, maybe even in opposition to what you wanted. And then this community group has their name on it as if it's something that they approve of, and they have to determine how they want to be represented. And so that idea of like, challenging the norm, challenging the institutions of the way that things should be, it does require just like, almost like an out, like a touch point with imagination. So much of the work that I've been doing now, especially with, Sierra Club has me working on transitioning toward clean energy and then things like environmental racism. It's so hard to have conversations with folks who really don't think outside of like US law and US policy EPA policies and stuff like that. It's hard to get them to step outside of that framework and understand that all these things we want to get rid of are coded in the DNA of the United States. You might want to look at a place that wasn't built on enslavement, genocide, and environmental destruction. You might want to look abroad. There's so many other nations, cultures, peoples, moments in history, individuals who don't see themselves as change makers or learners or scholars. There's so many of them who just aren't reached. And if you're able to tie a lot of them together and bring that comprehensive view of really what everybody else is thinking, you're able to, hopefully invite the willpower that's needed so that folks in power can make the decisions. If they don't make the decision you want them to make, you at least have enough people to challenge that power, whatever form that takes.
I think what you're saying is like, a huge part of this is like, be educated on things. However, don't let education condition creativity out of you. So many of us do that. Prime example, think about it. When you're a little big kid and you give them a marker, a crayon, or whatever, give them a coloring book and they're coloring all over the place, right? They don't know anything about coloring inside the lines. Who makes them color inside the lines? A teacher, right? Somebody, an adult. Somebody's like, no, you gotta color inside the lines. Only to grow up, if you become an artist, a major in art, or become an artist or whatever, you find out that negative space is an actual technique that you use. You use the negative space. Some people make complete pieces outside the lines. They never use the lines for that, right? So it's like, make sure that you're educated. Education is vital. However, don't let it condition your creativity out. Some of us begin to look at education like doctrine. And that's when I think it becomes, I think it can become dangerous, because when you let it start to become like doctrine, it's like, it's beating the creativity out of it. It's making you, it's creating an inability to look at other forms of educating yourself, or other places or avenues to get ideas, right? That's why when you're doing a research project, you don't do all your research reading one book. All of you have done papers, you're told that, get your information from however many, different sources, and then quote those sources. When you start to do everything from one book, that's when you get in trouble. And that's why in a lot of ways, we're not able to get things down, because unfortunately, we got a lot of people in a lot of spaces who are doing these jobs and these problems that are super convoluted and complicated, reading from one book. I used to always hate when people would say, racism is such a huge issue. It's all the ignorant people out there. It's all the stupid people out there. It's all the hillbillies who aren't smart. I'm like, no, you the dumb one. Do you understand how brilliant you have to be to, erect a racist system over 400 years ago, and to change it and keep and make changes to it so that it evolves, that it's still in place till this day? Some people say that times have changed. However, there are more Black and brown people in prison for nonviolent drug offenses than there were all that were enslaved during the time of slavery. So did we really get slavery, and did slavery really go away? Or should we be asking the question, did slavery get worse? When you take into account concepts like the 13th Amendment. More Black and brown people in prison for nonviolent drug offenses than there were all of enslaved. And then you couple that with the fact that Black men and white men between the ages of 18 to 35 experiment with drugs and alcohol the exact same rate. But 80% of the people in prison for those things look like me.
So word on Hamlin, one of the reasons I came to work here is that in the projects I was doing in my career, she showed up, got stuff done, and jumped in. And I really appreciate that culture of Hamlin, of the not letting education get in your way of creativity and just being like, how can this thing? But we're really grateful for you coming to Hamlin today. As you have probably heard, we're in the midst of really trying to figure out how to be a more reconciling and welcoming community where we all belong better, and not just rest on our laurels. Like, I think there tends to be a bit of a abolitionist women, like we have their legacy. Be like, all right, how do we show up now? So in the time that we have left, last few minutes, I'm curious if you have invitations or ideas of how, you know, young people looking for jobs, looking for summer internships, like getting involved in their community here, like what are the ways to plug in? I mean, we've talked about a lot of the ways to show up in the world, like here in Ramsey and the work you're organizing. Are there opportunities?
Can I just add a sort of a PS to that question, which is, I've been thinking a lot in this discussion about between being a scholar and being a scholar activist. If that's a term that folks have heard before or as a scholar activist, as a student, what that might look like. And that kind of piggybacks on the question that you're asking is how do we as an institution or we support scholarship, but we want it to be really productive activist scholarship. And what is it that that looks like for how to sort of nurture that? Does that make sense?
I'm going to add a PPS because part of what here is an institution is she also directs the Natural Science and Environmental Education program. So it's not just college student age learners, it's people who are in the education system and in informal settings, but there's just so much space of people who see themselves as educators in being able for that collar of the broader realm of scholar activists.
Only issue that I have with academia in general, someone who tried college, got away with 3.5 credits, something like that. There's this tendency to monopolize information, right? So anytime that you're trying to enter into alliance with folks, anytime you're trying to build a coalition, you need to think of the resources that you bring, the resource that you're going to need to create a collective. There's a lot of resources here. A lot of those resources are knowledgeable and brave thinkers. And a lot of those resources are history that's kind of been hoarded by academia, right? I think that there are a lot of gaps that need to be filled because while community members from oppressed communities know what it feels like to be oppressed, they know what those conditions are, they don't always know filling in all the historical blanks that have happened. For me, more than 50% of my interest in reparations is because I'm interested in consequences, right? I'm interested in reparations that actually leads to fundamental and systemic changes. And so I think that we need to do things like, you know, we're talking about the war on drugs. We need to investigate the impacts of the David J. Rockefeller laws on creating this huge prison population. We have to think about the role of US intelligence and things like COINTELPRO in the assassination of Black intellectuals, right? I think that there's a lot of parts of history that are unknown, that are underknown, or that are honestly too difficult to digest that could be shared out in community who's really just waiting for a justification to put their truth into action. I found that a lot of the time, you know, before I moved to the Twin Cities, I'm from Indiana, and I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana, in the middle of the city. I didn't know anything about the present existence of Indigenous people in the United States. I knew what they taught you in the 1990s in Indiana in school, which is not much, hardly any, right? And so as I came here and I'm learning some of the sites, it wasn't took me maybe 5 or 6 years of talking through relationship with folks, with activists, with people in Indigenous communities to eventually gain an understanding of the history of the expulsion of the Dakota people, how that history plays out geographically. I could see it driving down 94, 35, and also to hear about the multiple decades of work that's been put into creating a form of reparations for them. And so I think fighting this institutionalization and this hoarding of knowledge is something that could really help folks who are already in movement, already rooted in community. And that could be, you know, the mutual trade-off that's really needed. Because also there's a lot of folks in the university who are only seeking community, seeking a sense of belonging and something to do with their knowledge. So I think that we could fill in some of those gaps by some of these partnerships.
Students can do, they take full advantage of this time in your life right now to like get out in the community, meet folks of all walks of life. And I know that sounds like cheesy and cliche, but a lot of us don't do it. Like, you know, like I said, I coach high school boys. You know, I've coached, you know, kids who go, you know, gone off to college. Like, most of you like hang with your clique and that's it. Like, well, how many of you really going out, like investing in communities and doing things that aren't normal to you with people who don't look like you? How many of you are really going out and meeting elders and volunteering at spaces, not because you have to for a class, not because you have to for a sport, but because you're trying to like genuinely, like you're just hungry and trying to learn about the community, learn about an organization, different things like that. Like building, like I would almost say building a community network is more important than building a professional network. And the reason why I say that, like she just mentioned, is like Mr. Giles, like he's been around this community forever. You'd be amazed about how much of an impact he would have on you getting a job somewhere in his community because he's that respected. You thinking you need to impress somebody with a suit and tie on. You come somewhere like Ramsey County, like looking for a job, where we got community members on the panel, like knowing the community and building those networks with those people are important too, as well as, different professionals, because you never know what you're going to do. Like I had no idea that I would fall into the profession that I fell into, and I absolutely love it. I would also say, get out of your brain this concept of what something should look like, whether it be a person that works a job, whether it be a job, whether it be what success looks like, whether it be how to solve a problem. The answer to the problem that you're trying to solve, whether it be personally or professionally, may look completely different than what you're expecting. I can tell you right now, 10 times out of 10, nobody expects me to be a doula. I got about 30 tattoos. I got my dreads go down to my butt. I'm like 240 pounds. When the couple times that I've walked into a delivery room, ready to help with a baby, I'm like, let's rock and roll. Like the healthcare professionals are like, who is this? When I've done speaking engagements and stuff like that, nobody expects me to do what I do, but I do, and I'm good at it, real good at it. Just like I'm sure that like a bunch of you in here has like certain skill sets or talents that don't necessarily fall into some box or concept about, what I'm saying, like that matches what people think you should look like. I say as far as an as a university, like I would say the onus is more on a university than it even is on the students, like to do things that make you very uncomfortable. Like there's a lot of academia, and a lot of universities that love to push, like talk about how they're like vanguards of progressive thought and stuff like that. But when the rubber hits the road, and when a few donors start making, making some rumbles or talking about how they don't want to fund this or fund that, or get in somebody's ear, all of a sudden, start tiptoeing around like controversial things. Like you either stand for it or you don't, but you can't be here like leading and molding young minds, telling kids what they should do and how they should be ready to change the world, when as an organization, you're not willing to take the first steps of also helping to change the world because they're looking at you as their leaders, right? And not saying you all individually, but I'm saying the organization is a leader. Like they came here because this is where they were taught that this is, these are institutions that are supposed to give them the keys to unlocking their brains of creativity and being able to critically think to change the world. Yet when stuff gets tight, when the pressure gets tight, all of a sudden they do the same thing that everybody else does. This is an institution that has, donors, they got folks with money behind it. How's that supposed to make a young kid feel who come from different backgrounds and stuff like that? But how are they supposed to feel about changing the dynamic of how things are if an institution that seemingly has more power than they think they have as an individual isn't willing to lay its neck out? So I would say there's got to be more conversation amongst universities about, like, no matter how controversial it is, like, what are you actually willing to like step out on a limb for? Or are you willing to play it safe? Are you willing to just talk or whatever, but play it safe when stuff gets sticky? It's real easy. I mean, I always tell people like the real test of the type of person you're gonna be is not whether or not you're comfortable being a hero. Are you cool being the villain? Just think about it. It's easy to be. Everybody's got it confused they call villains cowards or whatever. It's easy to be the hero. Everybody loves a hero. Who wouldn't want to be the person that everybody likes? But how tough you got to be the person that everybody hates? And when you live in a society when everything, like we talked about, has been built on white supremacy, or in that world where it makes it easier to do the wrong thing than it does to do the right thing, chances are to do the right thing, you're going to have to do something that a lot of people are going to hate. How comfortable are you standing in that space?
I love this as a space we have to let students go to their next class, but that's such a great piece that I hope you carry with you. It's like, where do you have to show up as a villain to be with respect? Respect is the theme of this week in our reading. So I kind of love, like, what's the moral integrity of that villainhood? So thank you both so much for your visits today. Awesome time for showing up.
For sure, yeah.
So yeah.
You have to say hi to Mr. Melvin for me when if you talk to him soon.
Will do, yeah.